They called it the next war in the war, a revolution hidden beneath an already lethal ocean. By 1943, the Atlantic had become a gauntlet. Allied convoys crossed a field of steel and flame. Sonar pings and escort screens turned once confident U-boats into hunters who were hunted. The wolf packs that had stalked merchantmen in 1940 were now bleeding men and machines at rates the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. From the cramped conning towers of tired Type VII boats, the thought spread like a fever. What if a submarine did not have to surface to breathe? What if it could run fast and deep, silent and invisible, for hours, even days, beneath the sea? What if the hull itself, the shape of the boat, and the whole philosophy of undersea warfare were reinvented? That idea became an obsession in German naval yards and Luftwaffe-style design bureaus. It needed engineers, new metals, new batteries, and a doctrine contrary to everything U-boat captains had learned. It needed the sort of thinking that turns a defensive advantage into a strategic weapon. They named the program in prosaic terms, Elektroboot, but the ambitions read like prophecy. At the heart of the project was a simple, brutal diagnosis. Existing U-boats were built for surface running. Diesel engines gave them range. Electric motors let them creep underwater for an hour or two. But the Allies had closed the gap. Radar, HF-DF direction finding, escort carriers, Hedgehog mortars, Hedgehog's explosive math, all of it turned surfacing into a moment of death. The U-boat that only dived for survival was doomed when survival itself required leaving the sea. Engineers answered with an inversion. If the submarine's nominal state of operation was underwater, then its hull form, propulsion, crew systems, and weapons had to be optimized for submerged performance. No more compromises for surface seaworthiness. Aim for the quietest, cleanest, most hydrodynamic shape human hands could forge. Put power inside large battery banks. Fit the boat with a snorkel to run diesels at periscope depth but not beach its silhouette on the horizon. Automate reloads. Bend the torpedo into a magazine rather than a single tube. Make silence a weapon. The Type VII was the result, a cylindrical teardrop hull that read as aerodynamic as an aircraft fuselage in water. Flush decking, retractable fittings, a streamlined periscope tower. Inside, banks of heavy lead-acid batteries filled cavernous compartments that turned weight into endurance. Electric motors pushed the boat to unprecedented submerged speed. The figures were astonishing on paper. Sustained underwater speed of more than 10 knots, burst to 17 knots, enough to outrun many escort ships on the surface, and to reposition between targets while remaining submerged. Where earlier U-boats were fish that briefly dove, the Elektroboot promised to be a predator that lived below the line. But blueprints are cheap, steel, and men are costly. The program fell into the vortex that consumed late-war Germany. Allied bombing hammered yards. Skilled labor vanished into military service. Production lines, once a marvel in the 1930s, slowed and splintered. The first Type VII boats left yards incomplete with hurried welds and rushed systems. When Castro-calibrated inspection revealed shoddy workmanship, designers despaired. A boat so optimized for stealth could be fatally betrayed by a poor joint or a leaking hatch. Beyond the Type VI, there were stranger experiments. Walter Propulsion promised to smash the final limit of submerged speed. Instead of depending on the air-hungry diesel engine recharged by snorkel, Professor Helmuth Walter's system burned highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide to produce steam and oxygen for a turbine, a closed system that could operate entirely without atmospheric air. The experiments produced small boats that screamed underwater at speeds previously unimaginable. They were dangerous, volatile, and complex. They needed special fuel, impossible tolerances, and crews prepared to live with the constant risk of catalytic detonations. In war, complexity is a liability, and the Walter boats, brilliant on test benches, never scaled into an operational fleet large enough to matter. There was mystery, too. Missions that whispered of technological cargoes and diplomatic last rides. U-234, a Type XB mine-laying and transport submarine, left Kiel in April 1945 bound for Japan with a manifest that read like a spy novel. Drawings, blueprints, specialized equipment, and according to interrogations after the war, small crates of components, perhaps even uranium oxide. Whether U-234 was carrying the raw materials for a nuclear program, or just jet engine blueprints and guidance equipment, the voyage underscored a new truth. The submarine had become not just a torpedo boat, but a courier in a collapsing empire, carrying secrets across a world rent by war. The operational logic changed too. Type 20-1 doctrine demanded new tactics: attack submerged at night, infiltrate convoys by depth and stealth rather than horizontal approach, fire torpedoes while moving silently below sonar horizons, random surface attacks and massed wolfpack nights, tactics that had worked in 1941, now appeared wasteful and suicidal in 1944. The Elektroboot asked captains to trust their instruments over instincts born from the diesel age. But for all the promise, reality had teeth. The Allies learned from the first captured examples. They adapted sonar, developed short-range plenty of ASW weapons, refined intercept tactics that neutralized even stealthy boats. And Germany's production problems turned idea into tragedy. Hulls rushed to sea with immature electronics, unreliable hydraulics, and crews insufficiently trained for a platform that demanded seamless teamwork between engineering and seamanship. In field trials, Type VII boats frequently failed systems at critical moments, or were simply not present in numbers when convoys appeared. The revolution arrived late and half-baked, and yet the shadow these boats cast during the war and afterwards was outsized. Naval designers from Britain to the United States read the Elektroboot's contours and realized the future had already been sketched in German yards. A submarine that lived submerged, that used battery power as the principal mode of operation, that relied on stealth, endurance, and speed rather than intimidation and mass. The post-war submarines, Guppy conversions, Soviet Navy types, the first nuclear-powered boats, inherited elements of that thinking. If the Type 21 was the idea, the Walter boats were the dare, and U-234 the secret courier of a dying Reich. The true drama was not merely technical, it was cultural. The Nazi submarine program had been a mirror of the regime itself, brilliant engineering married to a brittle industrial base and a doctrine that refused to adapt until the cost was measured in steel and lives. Below the waves, in cramped engine rooms, ordinary crews paid the price for extraordinary theory. They learned that silence, once achieved, is more dangerous than noise, because when systems fail, the quiet becomes a tomb. A submarine that cannot speak to the outside world, that must depend on instruments, on sealed bulkheads and battery seals, requires a level of workmanship and logistics the Third Reich could no longer guarantee. The Type 10-1 would survive the war with few victories but enormous influence. The story of the secret submarine is a paradox. The plan to build a better Predator arrived too late to save the hunters. Yet, in the hushed hangars of peacetime navies, the echoes of that design would steer the next century of undersea strategy. When Allied occupation forces entered the submarine pens at Bremen, Hamburg, and Kiel in May 1945, they found ghosts of a future that had almost surfaced. The concrete shelters, massive fortresses of steel and reinforced concrete, had been bombed relentlessly, yet still stood, their flooded docks concealing half-built shapes beneath dark water. Workers in tattered uniforms emerged from tunnels that smelled of oil and rust. On the slips lay dozens of unfinished hulls, each more advanced than anything the victors had ever seen. They weren't the rounded, riveted shapes of the Atlantic wolfpacks. These were sleek, welded bodies, streamlined, almost organic. The engineers who accompanied British and American forces recognized them instantly. Type VII Elektroboot. Germany had planned to build hundreds, a completely new class of submarine that would turn the ocean from Allied highway to hunting ground once again. At the front of one yard, Chalk still marked the blueprint on a bulkhead. Schnellboot unter Wasser. Fast boat underwater. Those three words captured the idea that had obsessed the Kriegsmarine's Technical Bureau since 1943. In conventional U-boats, speed was for the surface. Underwater, batteries drained quickly, motors overheated, and visibility vanished. The Type VII aimed to erase that distinction. In the dry dock, Allied technicians measured the hulls. Their noses were rounder, their sterns knife-edged, their propellers shrouded. Every external fitting that caused drag on earlier boats, gun mounts, railings, deck plates, was gone. Even the anchor was hidden behind a hydraulic cover. The hull was built almost entirely by welding, not riveting, reducing drag and acoustic signature. Beneath the smooth exterior lay the real revolution. 2 banks of lead-acid batteries, 372 cells, each the size of a filing cabinet, filled the lower deck. Together, they provided 3 times the electrical capacity of any previous submarine. Twin Siemens Schuckert electric motors could run continuously at high speed underwater, pushing the 600-ton hull to 10 knots for days or to 17 knots for short bursts. That made it faster submerged than most Allied destroyers on patrol. The diesel engines, 2 supercharged man units, were connected to a snorkel mast that could be raised to periscope depth, allowing the boat to recharge its batteries while remaining hidden below the surface. The snorkel itself was a marvel of mechanical pragmatism. Spring-loaded valves sealed it instantly if waves washed over the mast, preventing seawater from flooding the engine room. For the first time, a submarine could operate for weeks without fully surfacing. The crew accommodations were astonishingly modern. Bunks for every man, refrigerated storage for food, hot showers, a galley with electric ovens, air conditioning, primitive but functional. The Kriegsmarine had learned that fatigue killed efficiency faster than gunfire. A rested crew meant a silent, efficient boat. But in the control room lay the true evidence of evolution. Instead of individual valves and hand cranks, a central hydraulic system allowed a single officer to control ballast, depth, and trim with lever inputs. Automation, an unheard-of luxury in the previous generation, reduced human error. The periscope optics were Zeiss masterpieces. The fire control system could calculate torpedo solutions automatically, feeding data from sonar and gyro compass to targeting computers. To Allied engineers, the effect was surreal. This wasn't a submarine from 1945. It was a blueprint for 1960. And yet, despite the brilliance, the reality was tragic. Many of the boats the Allies found had never left the dock. Some had been sabotaged by their own crews as the war ended, engines blown, batteries shorted, torpedoes jettisoned. The few that did sail, like U-2511 and U-3008, went on single patrols so short they barely qualified as combat. Their commanders later said they could feel the future vibrating beneath their boots, but there was no longer a war to fight. When interrogated, the engineers behind the project admitted that they had known for months that Germany would lose. Their race to perfect the Elektroboot had become a kind of technical defiance, a way to prove that even in ruin, German engineering could outthink its enemies. "We wanted to leave behind a weapon that would make them pause," said one designer. "If we could not win the war, we would at least shape the next one." They succeeded. Within a year, the design data of the Type VII had been copied and distributed among the victors. The Royal Navy towed several intact hulls to Britain, designating one HMS N-41. The U.S. Navy shipped others across the Atlantic. U-2513 and U-3008 were reassembled and tested off Key West. Even the Soviet Union obtained several hulls from occupied yards, reverse engineering them into what became the Whiskey-class submarines, the backbone of their Cold War fleet. At sea trials, American crews came away shaken. "She's faster underwater than we are on the surface," one destroyer commander wrote. The Type VII could dive in less than 30 seconds and travel 340 miles submerged at 5 knots, distances unheard of in any Allied design. Her sonar, A curved array embedded in the bow could detect targets far beyond the range of her own torpedoes. The U.S. Navy's analysis report, declassified years later, summarized the shock. The Type 20 represents a quantum leap in undersea warfare. Had she entered service in quantity 6 months earlier, convoy operations in the North Atlantic would have faced unsustainable losses. But the revolution came too late. Germany's shipyards were collapsing, materials were scarce, and crews were rushed through training programs that once took years. Many new sailors had never seen the ocean before boarding. When Type 21 boats did reach the water, sabotage, shortages, and air attacks crippled deployment. Still, in those last chaotic months, the Reich's engineers kept designing. Beyond the Type 21 was an even stranger creature, the Type VII Walter Boot. Instead of batteries, it used chemical propulsion. Concentrated hydrogen peroxide decomposed to generate steam and oxygen for a turbine. Tests at Kiel in 1944 pushed prototypes to speeds of nearly 25 knots submerged, faster than any submarine in the world. But the price was danger bordering on madness. The fuel, known as perhydrol, reacted violently with oil or impurities. Engineers described it as liquid lightning. Several boats exploded during fueling. Even so, they kept building. The Allies found fragments of those Walter boats, some half-finished, others destroyed by retreating crews. British specialists studying the turbines concluded that the Germans had solved problems decades ahead of their time. Cavitation reduction, closed-cycle combustion, pressure equalization. The only thing they lacked was stability and time. From captured archives, interrogators pieced together a picture of ambition colliding with exhaustion. In 1943, Hitler himself had demanded a miracle submarine to reverse the war at sea. The Kriegsmarine promised him one. They believed that with 20 or 30 of the new boats in operation, convoy losses could break Britain's supply line. They weren't entirely wrong. Allied anti-submarine tactics of the era would have struggled against the Type 21's stealth. But miracles require production lines, and production lines require a functioning nation. Germany no longer had one. By war's end, 118 Type 21 hulls existed in various stages of completion. Only 2 conducted war patrols, neither sinking a ship. The rest became trophies, test beds, and museum pieces. Yet every navy that examined one drew the same conclusion. This was the template for the future. In American laboratories, engineers studying the Elektroboot's hydrodynamics noticed something almost poetic. When scaled and tested in water tunnels, the hull produced minimal turbulence, generating a quiet pressure signature even at high speed. The concept later evolved into teardrop shapes used on nuclear submarines. The silent predators of the Cold War, Nautilus, Skipjack, Thresher, all carried the DNA of the Type 21. It was the cruelest of ironies. A weapon built to sustain a dictatorship ended up defining the navies of the free world. Standing in the captured dockyards, Allied officers stared at the hulks of unfinished boats, their paint still gleaming, their hatches sealed forever. The war was over, but beneath the smell of diesel and seawater, a new chapter was beginning, one written not in propaganda, but in design blueprints and sonar echoes. The secret submarine had failed to save its empire, but it had succeeded in building the future. It was April 1945, and Germany was collapsing by the hour. Cities burned, the Rhine had been crossed, and even Berlin could hear the thunder of Russian artillery. But beneath the chaos, one last secret mission slipped quietly from Kiel Harbor. U-234, a massive Type XB submarine, repurposed for a voyage halfway around the world. Her orders were extraordinary. Sail for Japan, the last surviving Axis ally. Deliver to them the crown jewels of German science, jet aircraft parts, radar systems, specialized optics, and 2 Japanese officers carrying blueprints and diplomatic messages. The boat's manifest listed industrial goods and special cargo. What it didn't say was that among the crates in her forward compartment lay 560 kilograms of uranium oxide sealed in gold-lined canisters. Even today, historians argue what the uranium was for. Some believe it was meant for Japan's stalled nuclear program. Others think it was simply raw material, an offering to keep the alliance alive. Whatever the truth, the voyage of U-234 became the final chapter in Germany's technological odyssey, a submarine carrying both the secrets of the future and the ghosts of a dying empire. The man in command was Kapitänleutnant Johann Heinrich Fehler, a veteran navigator with ice in his veins. His orders were clear: avoid all contact, run deep and silent, and deliver the cargo to the Japanese port of Sasebo. His crew numbered 49, joined by 14 passengers, scientists, engineers, and 2 Japanese naval officers in crisp uniforms, who spoke little but observed everything. When U-234 slipped under the waves on the night of April 15th, the crew could hear the distant rumble of Allied bombers overhead. They knew the war was ending. They also knew that surrender at sea was not an option. The Reich was dying, but its secrets would live on, buried, traded, or delivered into the hands of those who could still use them. For the first days, the journey went smoothly. The submarine ran submerged by day, surfaced at night to charge its batteries, and transmit coded position reports. The Atlantic, once a graveyard for U-boats, was strangely empty. Allied convoys steamed north toward Europe, not south toward the equator. U-234 was slipping through the cracks of history. Inside the hull, however, tension was unbearable. The passengers were a strange mix: rocket scientists from Peenemünde, Luftwaffe radar engineers, chemical experts from IG Farben. They debated in whispers about who would rule the post-war world: the Americans, the Soviets, or perhaps the Japanese with German technology in their hands. Fehler kept them busy checking cargo and maintaining the delicate air purification systems. The slightest leak could betray them to radar or sonar. On May 4th, as the boat crossed into the mid-Atlantic, the radio operator intercepted the message that froze everyone on board: "The Führer is dead. Continue resistance." Then, days later, the next transmission, unmistakable and final: "All U-boats cease hostilities. Proceed to surrender to Allied forces." Fehler locked himself in the control room. The officers gathered around the chart table, staring at the ink line tracing their path toward the east. Japan was still fighting, but for how long? Surrender meant imprisonment. Continuing meant treason to the new German command, but perhaps loyalty to the old one. The 2 Japanese officers demanded that the voyage continue. "We are allies," they argued. "You must complete the mission." Fehler listened silently. Then he said the words that sealed the fate of U-234. "The war is over. For Germany. I will not die for ghosts." That night, the 2 Japanese officers retired to their cabin. By morning, they were dead, cyanide capsules clenched between their teeth. Fehler ordered them buried at sea. Wrapped in weighted canvas, their bodies slipped into the black Atlantic. For the rest of the crew, it was a grim ritual of endings. Fehler made his decision. U-234 would surrender, but not to the Soviets. He plotted a course for North America, surfaced under white flag markings, and transmitted his intention to Allied forces. On May 14, 1945, the submarine rendezvoused with the American destroyer USS Sutton near the Grand Banks. The boarding was surreal. American sailors expected a starving, ragged crew. Instead, they found immaculate order: officers in clean uniforms, a spotless control room, and crates stacked neatly from bow to stern. When they read the manifest, they realized what they had captured. Among the cargo were jet aircraft components for the Me-262, blueprints for rocket engines, advanced optics, and the uranium oxide. The crates were stamped with the chemical code U-235. The coincidence was too eerie to ignore. Some of that uranium, historians now suspect, was later shipped to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Manhattan Project refined fissile material for the bomb that would end the Pacific War. The intelligence officers who inspected U-234 were stunned. "This is not a warship," one wrote. "It is a time capsule." The submarine represented the last gasp of Nazi ambition. an arc of forbidden technology sailing from one defeated empire to another soon to fall. The scientists aboard were interrogated for months. Some ended up in America under Operation Paperclip, others faded into obscurity. Fehler himself was questioned, then released years later, living quietly in Hamburg until his death in 1993. He never spoke publicly about what the Japanese officers had said, or what else might have been in those sealed canisters. The submarine's hull was divided among the Allies. The Americans took most of it. The British received a few technical documents. The Soviets demanded samples but were refused. The uranium, according to post-war archives, was sent under armed guard to the U.S. Navy Yard at Portsmouth and then transferred to the Manhattan Project. Officially, it was unusable industrial material. Unofficially, no one has ever proven otherwise. To the men who boarded her, U-234 symbolized something deeper than secret cargo. It was the embodiment of a regime that believed technology could outlast defeat. In her narrow corridors and humming diesel rooms, they saw the same paradox they'd seen in the Type VII: genius without wisdom, ambition without humanity. When Allied naval engineers later examined the boat, they admired the craftsmanship. The welds were perfect. The pressure hull was flawless. The navigational equipment, though battered, was superior to anything the Allies had built in 1945. One officer noted that every bolt on this ship tells a story of obsession. They dismantled U-234 slowly, documenting every system. Some parts went to research labs, others were scrapped. The hull was finally sunk off Cape Cod as a torpedo target in 1947. She went down silently, carrying with her the last physical link between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But her legacy didn't sink with her. U-234's voyage confirmed that the Germans had not merely been fighting the war, they'd been preparing for the next one. Her cargo reflected a vision of warfare decades ahead: jet propulsion, radar jamming, guided weapons, even early research into nuclear energy. In the cold archives of captured German documents, Allied analysts coined a new phrase for what they saw: technological fatalism. The idea that the Third Reich believed pure innovation could compensate for collapsing reality. Submarines that outran escorts, planes that defied gravity, rockets that reached the edge of space, all of it brilliant, all of it useless when the factories were rubble and the soldiers starving. U-234 was the epitaph of that belief. She had carried the future in her cargo hold and sailed straight into irrelevance. When her hatches were finally sealed for the last time, a U.S. officer reportedly wrote in his log, "The war ended before she could begin hers." When U-234 vanished beneath the Atlantic for the last time, it should have been the end of the story. But secrecy has a gravity of its own, and in the chaos of 1945, even silence left an echo. Across Europe's shattered ports, rumors began to spread among Allied occupation troops of ghost U-boats that had never surrendered, submarines seen slipping away into the South Atlantic, convoys of unmarked vessels vanishing into the fog near Argentina, and somewhere, whispered, in the smoke-filled mess halls of naval bases from Portsmouth to Buenos Aires, the legend of the Nazi escape fleet. It started with the Walter boats, a class of submarines that looked like they belonged in science fiction, not 1945. Designed by engineer Helmut Walter, these prototypes used concentrated hydrogen peroxide as fuel. When decomposed, it produced superheated steam and oxygen, driving turbines underwater at 25 knots submerged, twice the speed of any Allied sub. To Allied intelligence, these vessels sounded impossible. Submarines that could outrun destroyers, that could stay submerged for days without surfacing. That wasn't warfare. It was alchemy. The British found the first of them at Cuxhaven, still sitting in dry dock when the war ended. The V-80 and its descendants, the Type 16 and 16HB, had been experimental, but their technology was years ahead of anything else in the world. The blueprints stunned engineers: streamlined hulls, retractable periscopes, a snorkel system allowing diesel operation underwater. and the Walter propulsion unit, an engineering nightmare and a masterpiece combined. These weren't just boats. They were the seeds of the Cold War submarine race. When Allied teams opened the archives at Kiel and Bremen, they discovered plans for something even more ambitious, the Type VII, a 1,000-ton undersea interceptor capable of 26 knots submerged, with a theoretical range of 4,000 nautical miles. It was designed not to flee but to hunt, to destroy Allied convoys and vanish beneath the thermocline, invisible to sonar. Germany had built none of them before surrender, but it didn't need to. The ideas were enough. Within a year, those blueprints would shape every submarine on Earth. The British captured U-1407, a Walter boat scuttled in shallow water. They raised it, repaired it, and renamed it HMS Meteorite, testing it for years. The Americans and Soviets copied the designs line for line. When the Cold War began, the shadows of these boats moved under both flags. But back in 1945, nobody outside the intelligence circles knew that. And in the absence of facts, the myths multiplied. Argentine fishermen began reporting sightings of long, black hulls surfacing at night along the Patagonian coast. In July 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender, U-530 appeared out of nowhere at Mar del Plata, Argentina. Her captain claimed they'd been at sea for 66 days, surrendered voluntarily. But when interrogated, the timelines didn't add up. How had a Type I submarine with a range of only 13,000 kilometers remained at sea for over 2 months after the war ended without refueling? Where had she been? What was she carrying? 2 months later, another U-boat, U-977, surfaced at the same harbor. Her commander, Heinz Schaefer, told an equally bizarre story. He claimed he'd taken his crew on a 66-day underwater voyage from Norway to Argentina, never surfacing until the equator. Impossible, the American said. The batteries couldn't have lasted that long. But Schaefer passed lie detector tests, and his logbooks matched the celestial navigation data. Somehow, the man had pulled off one of the most daring submarine voyages in history, just to surrender on the other side of the world. And so, the legend exploded. The tabloids claimed that dozens of submarines had fled to South America, carrying Nazi gold, secret weapons, and fugitive war criminals. Some said they'd escaped to a secret base beneath the Antarctic ice, the infamous Neuschwabenland. Others swore that Hitler himself had been smuggled aboard one and was living in exile under a false identity. All nonsense, of course. But to a world still haunted by war, it felt believable. The truth was both smaller and stranger. Many U-boats had been missing at war's end, 156 to be exact. Most were later found scuttled, sunk, or mislogged in chaos. But a few, like U-530 and U-977, had genuinely made transatlantic crossings. They weren't carrying gold or Hitler. They were carrying shame. Their captains refused to surrender to the Soviets and chose exile over captivity. Still, the Allies couldn't dismiss the rumors entirely. Naval intelligence quietly investigated the Antarctic claims, cross-referencing shipping routes and fuel calculations nothing matched. But by then the myth had taken on a life of its own. The Cold War made it convenient. When Soviet submarines began operating in the South Atlantic in the 1950s, Western journalists revived the Ghost Fleet story, claiming they were using Nazi bases as cover. Conspiracy books like The Murmansk Mystery and Hitler's Ice Fortress turned failed prototypes into pulp mythology. What none of those authors knew was that some of the wildest Nazi submarine projects were real, just never completed. In 1944, German engineers had proposed a submarine aircraft carrier, the Type I, designed to launch an Arado 231 scout plane from a watertight hangar. Another design, the Type 21 Elektroboot, was so revolutionary that it became the direct ancestor of the U.S. Navy's Guppy subs and the Soviet Whiskey class. The Type 21 could travel 17 knots submerged, with a streamlined hull that rendered it nearly silent to Allied sonar. Only 2 entered combat before Germany surrendered, But after the war, every major navy built copies. The American USS Nautilus, the first nuclear sub, was born from that design lineage. Even the word U-boat stopped meaning German. It had become the blueprint for modern underwater warfare. The irony was perfect. The submarines that were supposed to save the Third Reich instead rebuilt the navies of its conquerors. And yet, deep in the collective imagination, the myth of the Ghost Fleet refused to die. In 1958, Argentine police found a rusting conning tower buried in the sand near San Matias Gulf. Divers investigated and confirmed it was the wreck of a German submarine. Its markings burned away, its number untraceable.